For more than 20 years, the Passion of the Christ has continued to provoke discussion. One of the most surprising elements of the film was not its violence, its language, or its realism, but its portrayal of evil. Satan appeared rarely, spoke little, and yet left an impression that audiences have not forgotten. As anticipation grows for the resurrection of the Christ, one question repeatedly surfaces: will Satan appear again? And if so, how? This question matters because Mel Gibson is not a filmmaker who treats spiritual themes casually. His previous work demonstrated a deliberate refusal to turn evil into spectacle. Instead, he portrayed it as something quiet, unsettling, and ultimately powerless. This essay does not rely on rumor or speculation. It examines how Satan was portrayed in the Passion of the Christ, why that portrayal succeeded, who the actor behind it was, and, most importantly, how Mel Gibson is likely to approach the relationship between good and evil in the resurrection.
In order to really tell the story properly, you have to start with the fall of the angels.
The goal is not to predict scenes, but to understand a philosophy of storytelling, one that may explain why the most powerful presence of evil is often the one that speaks the least. When The Passion of the Christ was released in 2004, much of the public discussion focused on its graphic depiction of suffering. Yet, from a storytelling and theological perspective, one of the film's most distinctive achievements was its portrayal of evil, specifically the figure commonly identified as Satan. Unlike traditional cinematic representations, Satan in The Passion was not introduced as a villain with motives to explain or arguments to deliver. There was no exposition clarifying who this figure was or what it wanted. Instead, evil was presented as a presence, quiet, observant, and deeply unsettling. This approach marked a deliberate departure from conventional biblical epics, which often rely on dialogue, dramatic confrontation, or visual excess to communicate moral conflict. One of the most striking elements of this portrayal was restraint. Satan appeared infrequently and almost never interacted directly with Jesus. The character moved through scenes as an observer, often standing at the edge of human suffering rather than participating in it. This choice subtly reinforced the film's theological position. Evil does not control events, even when it appears to be watching them unfold. Mel Gibson avoided turning Satan into a competing force equal to Christ. There was no suggestion of a cosmic duel or balance of power. Instead, Satan's presence emphasized contrast. The calm detachment of evil stood in opposition to the physical and emotional agony endured by Jesus. This contrast intensified the audience's awareness of moral tension, without shifting focus away from the central narrative of sacrifice. The absence of speech was equally important. Satan did not attempt to persuade, tempt, or debate Jesus through words. Silence became a defining characteristic of the character. This silence was not emptiness, it was calculated. It communicated confidence without authority, observation without control. In doing so, the film suggested that evil thrives not through dominance, but through proximity to human suffering. Another notable choice was the lack of explanation. Viewers were not told what Satan represented or how to interpret the character. This forced the audience to engage intuitively rather than intellectually. The result was a lingering discomfort that extended beyond the film's runtime. Many viewers reported that Satan's presence felt more disturbing precisely because it was understated. From a cinematic standpoint, this approach was highly effective. It avoided caricature and resisted the temptation to sensationalize evil. From a theological standpoint, it remained consistent with Christian tradition, which views evil as real but ultimately subordinate. Satan was present, but never victorious, visible, but never central. The success of this portrayal can be measured not by screen time, but by memory. Nearly 2 decades later, Satan remains one of the most frequently discussed aspects of the Passion of the Christ. This lasting impact suggests that Mel Gibson's method, suggestion over spectacle, silence over speech, was not only intentional, but effective. This precedent is essential when considering questions about the resurrection of the Christ. Gibson has already demonstrated that he does not need to dramatize evil to make it felt. He has shown that absence, restraint, and implication can be more powerful than explicit confrontation. The effectiveness of Satan's portrayal in The Passion of the Christ cannot be separated from the performance of the actor who embodied the role. Mel Gibson's casting choice was neither accidental nor conventional. Rather than selecting a well-known Hollywood figure or an actor associated with villainous roles, he chose Rosalinda Celentano, an Italian actress and musician whose screen presence aligned with the film's restrained vision of evil. Celentano was not widely recognized by international audiences at the time of the film's release. Her background was primarily in Italian cinema and music, and she carried none of the visual or cultural baggage that often accompanies recognizable actors. This anonymity was crucial. It allowed viewers to encounter the character without preconceived expectations, reinforcing the sense that Satan was not a personality to be understood, but a presence to be felt. One of the most discussed aspects of Celentano's performance was its deliberate ambiguity. The character's appearance was androgynous, avoiding clear markers of gender, age, or emotional expression. This ambiguity was not a stylistic flourish. It was a narrative tool. By removing familiar human traits, the character resisted easy identification or empathy. Satan did not resemble a monster, but neither did the character resemble a person the audience could relate to. Facial expression played a central role in the performance. Celentano maintained a controlled, almost serene demeanor throughout her appearances. There was no overt anger, no visible cruelty, and no theatrical menace. This calmness created unease. The character appeared untouched by pain, standing in silent contrast to the suffering that surrounded Jesus and the other figures in the story. The absence of emotional reaction became, paradoxically, the most disturbing feature of the role. Movement was similarly restrained. Satan did not rush, attack, or intrude. The character's physical stillness suggested patience rather than urgency. Evil, as portrayed here, was not frantic or desperate. It simply waited. This choice reinforced the film's underlying message that evil observes human weakness, but does not possess ultimate authority over events. Importantly, Celentano's Satan did not dominate scenes. The performance never competed with the central narrative of Christ's suffering and sacrifice. Instead, it functioned as a visual counterpoint, present enough to be noticed, restrained enough to avoid distraction. This balance required discipline, both from the actor and from the director. The success of this performance reveals much about Mel Gibson's priorities as a filmmaker. He values symbolism over explanation, atmosphere over exposition, and meaning over spectacle. Casting an actor capable of such restraint was essential to achieving this vision. Satan was not portrayed as a character with a storyline, but as an embodiment of opposition, quiet, detached, and ultimately ineffective. This casting decision also offers insight into how Gibson may approach similar themes in The Resurrection of the Christ. Rather than relying on dramatic antagonists or explicit representations of evil, he has shown a consistent preference for suggestion, silence, and visual implication. If evil appears again in The Resurrection, it is likely to follow this established pattern, if it appears at all. Any discussion of whether The Resurrection of the Christ will feature a satanic character must begin with an understanding of what the film is attempting to portray. Mel Gibson has repeatedly emphasized that The Resurrection is not a conventional sequel.
It took a long time to write. It's really ambitious, and it goes from like the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle.
It does not simply continue the historical narrative that ended at the crucifixion. Instead, it explores events that exist largely outside ordinary human experience, events that are theological, spiritual, and only partially described in Scripture. This distinction is critical. Films that rely on historical realism tend to depict moral conflict through visible action and dialogue. The Resurrection, by contrast, addresses a period traditionally understood as unseen, the time between Christ's death and his return from the tomb. In Christian theology, this is not a time of struggle between equal forces. It is a moment of transition, authority, and fulfillment. From this perspective, evil does not emerge as a rival power. It exists, but it does not drive events. The resurrection narrative centers on victory already secured, not on a battle still being fought. This theological framework strongly suggests that any depiction of evil, if present at all, would be secondary and restrained. Mel Gibson's previous work supports this interpretation. In The Passion of the Christ, evil was not portrayed as an active opponent attempting to alter the outcome. Satan observed, lingered, and reacted. but never influenced Christ's decisions. This aligns with a worldview in which evil is real but ultimately powerless in the face of divine authority. Gibson has also spoken about portraying spiritual realities without relying on literal or didactic explanations. He has expressed interest in showing truths that cannot be fully articulated through dialogue.
And I've just placed its development and its formation in the hands of Providence. And I think there's something bigger at play here.
This approach favors symbolism, atmosphere, and visual storytelling over explicit characterization. In such a framework, the presence of Satan as a named, speaking figure would be unnecessary and potentially distracting. It is therefore unlikely that the resurrection will introduce Satan as a dominant character or narrative force. A dramatic confrontation between Christ and a personified evil figure would undermine the film's central message. The resurrection is not about conflict. It is about completion. Evil, in this context, has already been overcome. If evil appears, it is more plausible that it will be implied rather than dramatized. It may be represented through environment, memory, or contrast. Darkness giving way to light, silence giving way to authority. This method would be consistent with Gibson's established style and with the theological meaning of the resurrection itself. Equally important is what Gibson is unlikely to do. There is no indication that he intends to elevate Satan to a central role, create extended scenes of dialogue, or frame the resurrection as a struggle between opposing powers. Such choices would shift attention away from Christ and towards spectacle, something Gibson has consistently avoided in his treatment of sacred material. Ultimately, the question is not whether evil exists in the resurrection, but how it is understood. In Gibson's vision, evil is not the focus of the story. It is the backdrop against which victory is revealed. Whether Satan appears as a presence, a symbol, or not at all, the emphasis remains on authority, transformation, and fulfillment, not opposition. The question of whether the resurrection of the Christ features a satanic character reflects a broader curiosity about how Mel Gibson understands and portrays spiritual conflict. It is a reasonable question, shaped by the lasting impact of the Passion of the Christ and by the unique subject matter of the resurrection itself. Based on what is known through Gibson's previous work, his public statements, and the theological framework of the story, there is no evidence to suggest that the resurrection will introduce Satan as a prominent or conventional character. There has been no official confirmation, no casting announcements, and no indication that evil will be dramatized through a speaking antagonist. What the Passion demonstrated is that Gibson does not need spectacle to communicate evil. His portrayal of Satan succeeded precisely because it was restrained, symbolic, and subordinate to the narrative of Christ's sacrifice. That same philosophy appears to guide the resurrection, a film concerned not with struggle, but with completion and authority. If evil appears in the resurrection, it is most likely to do so indirectly, through implication, atmosphere, or contrast, rather than through explicit confrontation. Such an approach would remain faithful both to Gibson's cinematic style and to the theological meaning of the resurrection, which presents evil not as a competing force, but as a defeated one. Ultimately, the resurrection of the Christ is not a story about Satan. It is a story about victory. Any presence of evil, visible or unseen, exists only to underscore that outcome, not to challenge it. This raises a final question worth considering. When telling sacred stories, is evil more truthfully portrayed through spectacle or through silence?